everyone, thank you for joining us today for the ANA eLearning Academy. Today we have our very own museum curator, Doug Mudd, who will be presenting on Lincoln, the Challenge. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat, and I will read them to them at the end. Thank you, Doug. Go ahead and get started.
Okay, thanks, Logan. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Lincoln and the images of Lincoln. So Lincoln, the Challenge, can numismatics convey the whole man? So Lincoln is perhaps the most recognizable American figure worldwide. His portrait has replaced George Washington's as the most commonly seen presidential image used across the country and as a symbol of freedom, strength, and justice. His name has been used for all kinds of things, from place names to business names, even cars and other things over the years. Numismatically, he has appeared on medals, paper currency, and commemorative coins of all types worldwide, ensuring that his image has appeared on literally billions of objects over the last 200 years. His image has changed over this time in response to changing popular public perceptions of Lincoln and his accomplishments, as well as for the intended purpose of his images, whether they're used for advertising or to represent some ideal, honest Abe, that kind of thing. So they've ranged from the tough wartime leader to the savior of the Union to the great emancipator, on to things that are more common today, the hardy laborer or the wise paternal figure. Lincoln has transitioned from the real man of his lifetime to a national and world icon representing any number of ideals, most commonly worldwide as a symbol of the fight for liberty across the globe. Here, however, we will stick to the narrow confines of the public Abraham Lincoln known to history and reflected in numismatic imagery. As can be seen from his relatively numerous photographs and the limited number of paintings from life, Lincoln had an exceptionally expressive face that changed considerably as he aged, making his portrait and by extension his character difficult to capture. So, Abraham Lincoln, as we all know, was catapulted onto the national scene just before the greatest crisis of our nation's history. Lincoln led the United States through the American Civil War, and it was the bloodiest civil war in our history and the greatest challenge to our Constitution. He managed to preserve the Union, abolish slavery, and strengthen the federal government through his determination, moral character, and sheer willpower. And here this map is interesting because it shows you the various dates for when the states seceded from the Union, which is sort of surprising. I hadn't realized how late some of the states actually seceded at one point. For example, West Virginia seceded from Virginia and then joined the Union as late as early 1862. But now on to the images. We'll start with the photographs. And Lincoln's photographs, let's see, wait a minute, there. Lincoln has somewhere in the order of about 130 photographs in the historical record. And what's interesting is how varied they are. You look at photographs such as these. This is the first set that I've chosen. And these images show a man who's beardless, which is something that most people aren't very familiar with. We're mostly familiar with Lincoln's image from our coinage, the penny or the cent, or from paper money, and he's invariably shown with a beard. There are other areas in numismatics where he isn't, particularly in tokens and medals, but by far his most common image is bearded. Now, one of the things about Lincoln is that he had a very distinctive face, not necessarily very handsome, but he had it was a very expressive face, so much so that it was a real challenge to try to capture his portrait. And arguably, there are people who say that his portrait has never really been captured because it is so difficult to. A portrait doesn't just show the image of what he looked like. It also shows something of the character and just the essence of a person, and that has been the challenge throughout the last 2 centuries. As John George Nicolai, uh, Lincoln's secretary, said at one point, Lincoln's features were the despair of every artist who undertook his portrait. The writer saw nearly a dozen, one after another, soon after the first nomination to the presidency, attempt the task. They put into their pictures the large, rugged features, and strong, prominent lines. They made measurements to obtain exact proportions. They petrified some single look, but the picture remained hard and cold. Even before these paintings were finished, it was plain to see that they were unsatisfactory to the artists themselves, and much more so to the intimate friends of the man. This was not This was not he who smiled, spoke, laughed, charmed. The picture was to the man as the grain of sand to the mountain, as the dead to the living. Graphic art was powerless before a face that moved through 1,000 delicate gradations of line and contour, light and shade, sparkle of the eye, and curve of the lip. In the long gamut of expression from grave to gay, and back again from the rollicking jollity of laughter to that serious, faraway look that with prophetic intuitions beheld the awful panorama of war and heard the cry of oppression and suffering. There are many pictures of Lincoln. There is no portrait of him. This is a very expressive statement of just how hard it was to capture the essence of Lincoln. So what has happened over the years is we see individual snippets that convey a part of Lincoln's essence, but none of them has really captured all of his essence, which is one reason why you see, especially today, but over the years, you've seen a proliferation of different portraits based on his original photographs, based on his the few paintings from life um, that are used to express different elements, Honest Abe or the strong wartime leader, etc. Photography in its infancy during Lincoln's lifetime provides roughly 130 images of him. The selection here includes 8 of the most famous portraits, which have served as the basis for many of the numismatic likenesses of Lincoln ever since his death. So here we have a series of images that include his portrait with the beard. And you can see from the first set, you have a young picture of him in 1854, one of the earliest of the images of him, not the earliest. And when I first saw this, I barely recognized him as Lincoln. I knew it because it was titled that, but this is a very different person than the one we normally see. And here, he's even more different. His hair in both situations is very tousled. It's just going any which way. And without the beard, you notice his nose as being probably the most prominent feature on him. Then the deep eyes and the high arching eyebrows. So we have the second one from 1857. So 1854, 1857, and 1858. In 1858, clearly this is somebody that you would identify as Lincoln. It's much more in the common pose that we see. And he has some of the features that we expect. His hair is groomed. You can see the prominent ears, and the nose is not quite as prominent because it's facing without much of an angle. Then we get the bearded images. 1861, just prior to his inauguration, he actually grew his beard in November of 1861. Interestingly, he's got his iconic beard, but he only grew this in November of 1860, as I said, after being advised in a letter by an 11-year-old girl, Grace Bedell, that a beard would improve his looks and get him more votes. The beard won public approval and may have helped save Lincoln from an assassination plot in March of 1861. When he was walking through Baltimore, he had a very sparse bodyguard detail, and they had a challenge of how to get him across the city without risking his life, because there were quite a few people that were against him at that point. And so by wearing a hat and stooping a bit so he didn't stand out for his height, and the fact that he had a beard, which nobody was used to at that point. He'd only had it for about 4 months at this point, and at that time, media wasn't able to convey images quite as quickly as they can now. So he became recognizable through his beard at this point. Now, Lincoln was famous for deprecating his looks. He was memorable, but not considered good looking. He had a gaunt, wrinkled face, a long neck, and he tended to tower over his contemporaries. So, while not exactly being handsome, he was very noticeable because his features were quite distinctive, especially his height. Throughout his career, mocking his appearance was considered fair game. In 1860, a paper in Houston called him the leanest, lankiest, most ungainly mass of legs, arms, and hatchet face ever strung upon a single frame. The Charleston Mercury described him as a horrid-looking wretch. Yet there was always something about him that made him stand out, and it's evident in these photos as we move forward. So here are the images that reflect him with his beard. You can see that he changes over time from the initial images. His face is always different. There's age that appears in here, but there's also expression. Even though with the early photography, you had to be very still. So it's very hard to capture people smiling because you can't hold a smile as well as you can hold a neutral face. But even with a neutral face, you can see his image has different elements to it. Now, this one I like the comparisons here because here you have the earliest image that we know of, photographic image of him, and again, he does not look like the Lincoln of popular memory and that people would recognize today. He's 37 years old at this point, and he was just on the verge of winning his first seat in Congress. Now, you put this next to, I think this is the last photograph taken of him, at least the last that I'm aware of, and you can see there's been a huge change in just 19 years. He's gone from a young man with basically a smooth face. His face is not quite as cadaverous and lean as it would be in just a few years from 1846. But other than his large ears, there's nothing particularly outstanding here. He does have large, deep-set eyes, but in this angle, you don't see the prominence of his nose. You go to the right, and you see that his eyes have remained basically the same. They look kindly, attentive, but his face has aged tremendously. So now you have much more pronounced wrinkles from the side of his nose. His forehead is now heavily wrinkled. His hair remains essentially the same. It hasn't receded much over what it had been when he was younger. But overall, you can see age has really affected him. You can really see what the Civil War has done, the tension, the stress that he was under has really made a huge difference. Now we'll go on to the numismatic images, starting with the paper money. So here we have this image that appeared on the $10 demand note of 1861. It was an image engraved by Charles Burt from the CS German photograph, which we saw earlier. Now, this image became the most iconic image to be seen during Lincoln's presidency and right up through into the 1870s because it was used for so many different purposes. So It was the most common seen by the public during his tenure as president because of the millions of copies that appeared on the banknotes, but also on bonds, stamps, and other government documents from 1861 to 1869. It was also used on the $20 interest-bearing notes as well. As we proceed with the following slides, note the variations in Lincoln's portrait, from the differences in his appearance, the shape of his nose, for example, which is more of a matter of interpretation or of the engraver than reality, and uh, to deliberate changes that were intended to influence the viewer, i.e., the stern wartime leader to paternal, comforting father figure, and so on. All of the following images are based upon the previous photographs or on paintings, many based on the photographs as well, or earlier numismatic portraits, especially after 1909, with those when Victor David Brenner's iconic images appeared. So here you see a Lincoln that is basically very neutral. He has a stern face, but there is no real emotion in it at this point. He's just looking on at the world. You can see his large ear, his prominent nose, but there's no particular impression other than as a stern leader figure. There's the larger version of it. Then we'll go on to one of the fractional notes, a 50-cent fractional note from 1863. Now this image is different because it's facing a different direction, and it shows a very different attitude, impression of who Lincoln was. Here you see a less detached image. This is an image of a Lincoln that's interested. He seems to be paying attention to something, but he doesn't have quite the stern visage. He looks more like a spectator with a little bit of a benign look because of his eyes. As we go forward, yet another image similar to the first, but notice that his expression, though still neutral and that he's not actually smiling or frowning, is very different. It gives a very different impression of him. Here you have a slight hint of some humor. He's definitely paying attention. It's a very realistic, human sort of image, and he looks like he's viewing things with interest and some amusement. Yet his strong features give him an air of wisdom as well. Now we go on to a $500 gold certificate, gold coin note of 1882. And here you have yet another impression of Lincoln. You have a little bit, his beard is a little bit less pronounced, but you get an image here of more of a statesman. He looks, again, very neutral, and his expression doesn't give much away. He looks more like he's playing poker, or he's a politician in the background looking on without giving anything away. And there's not a whole lot of his character shown here, but it gives you an idea of the variety of images that could appear. And these are all in the 19th century. So early images within 40 years of his death. Now we have a 20th century image on the $5 certificate of 1923, silver certificate. And here, this is going back to our second image, engraved image of him. There's a little bit of the humor. It's a very similar image with only slight variation. You get an aspect of him where you see almost the amused father figure looking on without, again, smiling or anything, but very much human and alive, with a figure that is not intimidating as some of the earlier ones were. Then we get to the $5 legal tender note of 1928. And here, in part because of how his head is held, but also the engraving, it's a modification of the previous one where the humanity and the incipient humor, I would call it, is more emphasized, and he looks like a guy that you'd want to come up to and talk to. And because of his strong features and all that, it looks like somebody who would know something. He looks like an intelligent person with probably a sense of humor. Very approachable. The $5 legal tender note of 1963 has very much the same look, with some variation, but not much. You again get this sense of somebody intelligent that is approachable, a little bit of a sense of humor, but you also, there's a touch of not exhaustion, but something of weariness, I think. So it captures a little bit more of how Lincoln appears in his later portraits towards the end of his life, where the war had been getting to him, and you can see that he was getting worn down. And then the most recent that I have of the portraits, the Federal Reserve note, $5 note of 2013. And here, again, the portrait has been changed a little bit, roughly similar, but you get the sense here of a neutral portrait, not giving away a lot. It's as if he was, standing for a portrait without thinking of anything humorous or being particularly imposing or anything else. He's just somebody. It's somewhat lifeless, somewhat without the humanity that you see in some other portraits. This is the portrait that appears on our current $5 notes, clearly based on the earlier photographs as well. Now we'll get to the numismatic record in metal, where there's been a considerably greater range of portraits, in part because he appears with a portrait facing left, a portrait facing right, then there's 3/4 facing and facing portraits, all of which allow for a greater range of the engravers and artists' skills. And depending on their skills, you can see images that are designed to give certain impressions. And some of that changes over time, from the earliest period where Lincoln is the hero that saved the country to the later periods where he becomes more of an idol, a representation, or an icon of certain ideal characteristics, such as Honest Abe or Abraham Lincoln, the savior of the country, the great patriot, the fighter for liberty, those kinds of things. So here we have the Lincoln, at the left, we have the Lincoln Commemorative Presidential Medal, produced in 1909 by Charles Calverley. Now this image is very accurate as far as the surviving photographs and paintings show. It shows him roughly in the period of 1864, somewhere in that range, where maybe 1863, where the war has affected him, but it hasn't really created the weariness and the haggard look that he had towards the end of his life. He's still looking better than that, and it emphasizes the strength of his character and um, the basic intelligence and power that his image portrays. So you have the strong, straight nose. You have the lines which uh, emphasizes strength rather than any age or weariness. So this is a very strong, positive image of him. On the left, you have a portrait that was done in 1961 by Ralph Manconi. And here I think you have a couple of things going on. It's a three-quarter portrait, so it's a little bit different than the one on the left, obviously, but it is also, it portrays a different Lincoln. The general features are the same, except that here you're getting an impression of a jolly Lincoln almost. This is somebody who's on the verge of laughing. He's smiling a little bit. He, by virtue of his features, he still has a strong face, but this is a much more approachable, perhaps jolly version of Lincoln, something you don't see very much in the earlier impressions, especially in the 19th century, just because of the photographs and also the reverence with which Lincoln was held in the earlier period, which has changed a little bit. Lincoln has become more a more human, less godlike figure, and I think it's conveyed through images such as this. Here are the famous plaques that were done by, on the left, you've got Victor David Brenner's plaque, which has the famous image of Lincoln that was eventually adopted soon afterwards for the Lincoln Cent. The head itself is very powerful, very solemn. It gives an image that is very respectable, and it's powerful and gives an image of leadership, quiet wisdom, perhaps. I've always disliked this image a bit, not because of the head, but because of the body here. His head seems way out of proportion, too small for the body. But these plaques are quite good and very collectible. Now, on the right, we have Don Everhart's plaque. Now, here you have an interesting image of the engraver engraving a model for the plaque, basically. But you have Lincoln in the background as the spirit or muse that is inspiring Victor David Brenner. So it's quite an interesting piece. I like the idea of Lincoln as the muse inspiring Brenner, and the image showing Lincoln, his upper body and his head, is in much better proportion than the previous one that Victor David Brenner had done. It's also an image of Lincoln earlier, showing, say, in 1861, 1862, he hasn't quite acquired the wrinkles and wear that the war would put on his face, but it shows a little bit of his gauntness because of his sunken cheek, you can see, and has a very stern sort of appearance here. Now, some more Lincoln plaques. On the left, we got one by Adam Peats. This is not a solid bronze or brass plaque. This is actually a thin piece of metal that's it's a reposite sort of work. And you have a Lincoln that's very different from the other portrait views we've seen. It's less like Lincoln. It's a less realistic portrait of Lincoln. It shows fewer of the wrinkles. The nose is not quite the same as you see in the photographs or in the earlier portraits. It seems to be a little bit lower on his face than it should be, and his image conveys an impression of a little bit of humor, but very little of um, the presence, the intelligence, and perhaps sternness of most of the earlier portraits of Lincoln. I it's not one that I like particularly because I don't think it gives a very good impression of the real Lincoln. But you can see it's a much more um, this figure looks more like the kindly grandfather, perhaps. On the right, you have the Chicago Coin Club 90th Anniversary Medal, which was based on a design by Augustus St. Gaudens for the standing Lincoln statue in Chicago. And here you have the Lincoln, the thinker, the jurist, as a lawyer. This is a pose that you would think that Lincoln would have been in, and as well as president before a speech or when standing before Congress. It's very serious. He's he's got the powerful face. The one thing that this portrait doesn't do well is his ear is covered, which is unusual from the other portraits and from the photographs. His ears were so prominent that it was very difficult for them to be covered up. They stood out from his head quite a bit. And his nose is actually a lot smaller relative to his face than usual. Now, Lincoln's ears were very famous um, in and because they stood out so much, he was often caricaturized as an ape with his ears sticking out and uh, funny faces because of all the different expressions he would have. So it's unusual that his ears would be covered by his hair in this, as in this portrait, as this image. So moving on, we have some of the early tokens that were issued. We have the Lincoln Presidential Campaign Token of 1860. This is an early example of the Lincoln legend where he's using his past to create an image that's appealing to his electorate. So you have Lincoln as he appeared in most of 1860 without his beard. So the portrait is somewhat unfamiliar. You can still see some elements: the large ear, the prominent nose, and this. I mean, this has a little bit of wear, but his eyes are deep set, and his chin, his jawline is the same. It's just without the beard, it's hard to recognize him as the Lincoln that most of us know and have seen in other portraits. On the reverse, this is part of the creation of the Lincoln legend. So it's showing Lincoln as the rail splitter, and there he is swinging a mallet and working on rails with a log cabin, presumably his home, in the background. So this is part of the imagery that he wanted to convey as he ran for the presidency, that he was a man of the people, that he had been on the frontiers, he'd worked with his hands, and he was a self-taught man. This is part of the imagery that was developed for that. Here we have some more images of the Lincoln without the beard. Here's Thomas Elder's medal in 1909, where on the reverse you see beloved alike by rich and poor. And here you have a Lincoln that's very early in appearance. This is a Lincoln that's somewhere between that 1846 and 1854 photographs. He has very few lines. You see an element of his gauntness because of his very prominent cheekbones and the sunken cheeks themselves. So it's relatively realistic. It shows, interestingly, a young man's viewpoint. Here he is with a young portrait, and the portrait itself conveys a little bit of just a hint of a smile, and his look is a hopeful look. This is a man looking forward to his future and hopeful. Uh, so it's nicely done. Perhaps not as realistic as some, but it captures the essence and of his features, as well as imparting a youthful air that you don't really see in any of the photographs or most of the other images. Then we get the presidential election token by Knox and Lang here on the right from 1860, and this is a poorly done, probably a very quickly done image. Um, and I'm not sure why anybody would have selected to use this, because if anything, it doesn't capture any of the noble features of his portrait. It actually looks more like a clown. The nose is very big. His ear is relatively larger, perhaps, than it should be, and the image itself has a sort of uh, rough, untrustworthy look. So I'm not sure that this did Lincoln much good for his campaign. Here we have the Lincoln Commemorative Medal from 1969. Now, this is an image that is based on some of those early tokens. You can see somewhat maybe a relationship to the previous token. It's not a very good likeness, and if anything, it's a caricature that doesn't express Lincoln very well. So it's interesting that they chose this image, because not only does it not really look like Abraham Lincoln much, it's also not a very flattering portrait. It looks like a discontented, perhaps angry, resentful person rather than the Lincoln that we know. On the reverse, however, at least they've conveyed some of his characteristics. You can see, despite his being mounted, that he is a very tall person. Um, the features are too small to really be able to tell much, other than the nose appears to be prominent and his ear is quite prominent. So here's an example of what happens with uh, low quality workmanship and not much attention to detail. You get poor quality images representing Lincoln, and in this case, it's related to where he was, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, and I don't think it's a great commemorative for Lincoln. Now we have one of the famous medals, the Lincoln Emancipation Medal of 1871, and here you have a head of Lincoln, and it's quite well done. The nose and the ear and the features are all very well done, with a little bit of an idealized portrait, because the wrinkles are not shown that by this time he had. But here you have an image of an idealized image, but it shows an image of somebody who appears to be wise and has a bit of a hopeful air to them. His mouth is not frowning, or he's not shown exhausted. He's looking forward, as if almost as if to a bright future in some ways. It's I would consider this to be a bit of a hopeful image based on its ideal look and the expression that is conveyed by his eyes and the tilt of his head. And this is one of the very nice medals produced by the Mint, the U.S. Mint. On the next one, yet another official medal, Lincoln Mourning Medal. So this medal and types like it were produced in very large numbers. There was a huge outpouring of grief and recognition when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And this medal is an example of the kind of works that were done. So it's done by, excuse me, W.H. Key in 1865, and it shows a somber Lincoln, not a whole lot of expression or anything other than it's a accurately done medal, a little bit idealized. His face was no longer as young looking as this, but it gives you an expression of somberness and neutrality. There's not any particular expression or feeling that's meant to be evoked other than this is Lincoln, and it's what you expect from a mourning image. We move on to our Lincoln Commemorative Medal of 1909 by the U.S. Mint. And here is another variation. You can compare that with the earlier medal. And here you have a very human looking Lincoln, realistically done from late towards the end of towards the last year of his life. You have the heavy wrinkling and sort of haggard look, the usual prominent nose and prominent ear and the beard, but he has a benign look on his face, somewhat of his a little bit of humor, maybe a readiness to smile and perhaps laugh. Yeah, and so that is a very nice portrait, a positive portrait of him. Then you get the next one by William Barber from an 1881 medalette, and here it's interesting because it seems I look at it and I see that his portrait seems subtly wrong. You can tell it's Lincoln, but it's not nearly as identifiable as other portraits. One of the things that is disturbing as far as identification is that his nose, while prominent, is also quite curved. And in most of the other images, you will see that his nose is mostly shown as very straight. If you look at some of the photographs, his nose appears to be very straight, with one or two at the right angle showing perhaps a very, very slight curve to it, nowhere near as prominent as this particular nose. And interestingly, the later portraits with his beard don't show his hair as being so scraggly or straggly as on this one. So it's not one of my favorite portraits. It doesn't show very much expression at all. He looks vacant here. He's got a vacant sort of stare. The line of his mouth, his lips are undefined, and because of I don't know if that was intentional or not, but his mouth extends back and then has a down curve to it, which you don't see in any of the other portraits at all. And so I think this is just a poorly done portrait, perhaps reflecting Barber's own feelings towards Lincoln. I'm not sure if that applies, but it's not a particularly good one, unfortunately. So I see somebody mentioned the part in his hair looks like it is on the wrong side. I'm trying to see if I'm not sure to what you're referring. I'll answer that later once we get to the end. Um, but it's not clear to me what you're talking about there, sir. The next images are some interesting ones because of their historical connections. Here we have one by Bolin, J.A. Bolin, with malice towards none. And this is an image that is, it's on a small medalette, and it's comparable to the campaign badges of the earlier period. But it's interesting because it's very linear in its approach, less modeling and more linear feeling to it, mainly because of the way he treated the hair. The hair is very heavily carved, and the image apparently is small enough where he wasn't able to put some of the detailing that you would expect, and yet it does have quite a bit of detailing. But here we have an image that is more of an effigy. It doesn't look like a human. It looks like an image of a human, and as such, it has more of a feeling of a mask, especially with the eye, the way it's treated. It looks like a blank eye, and so the overall impression is, yeah, this is an image of a person who looks like Lincoln, but the linear element to it takes away from its humanity. You get the hairline, especially uh, going straight down to his beard, which you don't see in any of the other images. So it's an impression that's not particularly well done and gives a very blank, almost a death mask feel to it. On the other hand, we have the Lincoln Indian Peace Medal of 1862, and here you get the impression, this is by S. Ellis, you get the impression that Mr. Ellis must not have looked very carefully at some of the images because the hair is not particularly well done and is actually not going in, not, the raised part of his hair is seemingly suspended in midair and doesn't seem to follow any of the images. It should be moving towards this side, the the right hand side a little bit, and the beard itself looks more like a fake beard that's been put on his chin, and most noticeably, his ear is covered by hair, and his nose has an outward curve instead of it having a either being straight or having a hump. It actually has a ski slope sort of look to it, which is not at all accurate based on any of the imagery that has come down to us. So it's interesting that for such an important medal that the image is less realistic and it gives a poorer impression of Lincoln than most of the other images we've seen. Now we go on to uh, some other medals that have been used. These are some of the first of the medals in the 20th century where uh, the image of Lincoln as a man of the people and the log cabin is shown where Lincoln was born. Here you have a medal that's by Heron Brothers and Company. It's for the centennial of his birth in 1909, and you have a very realistic portrait of Lincoln, uh, nicely done and showing a neutral impression of him. So he doesn't really show much emotion, but you get an, a feeling of a strong and wise sort of figure, but not a lot of humanity to him. The next series are more recent. Well, this particular one on the left is more recent. This is the Lincoln Commemorative Medal produced in the 1970s by the Medallic Art Company from the Pickett design, one of the engravers at the U.S. Mint of 1873. And here he's portrayed in an oval um, format, and you have an impression of Lincoln that's done competently, um, but it doesn't. It shows all of his features accurately, pretty well, and all that. But there's a lack of feeling in this. It's got a less of a um, human sort of look to it, and more of a an impression. Um, so it doesn't seem to capture much other than the parts of how Lincoln looked without creating a whole view of a person. So to me, it seems a little disjointed because while having the right features, it at best shows a little bit of uh, detachment, benign detachment, as opposed to the impressions we get in most of his images of somebody who's focused or at least has a powerful presence. The Lincoln Inaugural Medal uh, from the 1860s is, on the other hand, quite well done and gives you the impression of a uh, imposing figure, a figure that has a, a human element. Perhaps the cheek and the eyes are a little bit too emphasized. They distract a little bit because it gives him a little bit of a ape-like impression because of the nose and eye and the cheek sort of dominate the whole image somewhat, but is accurately done and has a quality of somebody that's important, that's has qualities that you'd want to see in your leader as a president. Then we have some of the images that appeared from abroad. Particularly, the French were big fans of Lincoln and early fans of Abraham Lincoln. Uh, they produced some really high quality medals, including this French Lincoln Commemorative Medal of 1865 by Frankie Magniadas. Here you have an image. First off, it's unusual in that his portrait image is facing to the left as opposed to most of the other ones we've seen, which are to the right. And so you're getting a different side of his face. And Magniatis does a nice job of creating a very human looking Lincoln. He's got a little bit of a wise look to him with a little bit of humor. The one striking element that's a little bit in variance to what we see normally is he also he put it looks like the head from the chin and the jaw to the ear and then the back of the hair is placed on an incongruous uh, neck. The neck and the shoulders that are shown here are very muscular looking, which is very much different than the actual gaunt and basically very thin and gaunt reality of Lincoln. one of the reasons why Lincoln wore high collars in most of his photographs and was shown with high collars in his paintings is because he did have a very gaunt figure, and his neck was uh, fairly thin and wrinkly, and so he tried to hide that because it didn't give a strong impression. But the medal is quite nicely done, and it looks beautiful, especially when combined with the quality of the image on the reverse. Now we go back to some more left-facing images. Here's a Lincoln campaign token from 1864. So this is his second presidential run. And here we have to think that the engraver really didn't spend very much time looking at Lincoln portraits, because this looks more like a generic bearded man. It has very little uh, resemblance to the actual Abraham Lincoln. Um, So it's, again, another campaign token where you have to wonder how much this token would have helped his campaign. It doesn't give an impression of the real person at all. On the other hand, you have the Lincoln Centennial Medal by Jules Royen, 1909, and here you have a beautiful impression of Lincoln. Um, the neck is proportional as opposed to the French version, and the all the details are there. You see the wrinkles and the wear, but you also have a look of benign um, hope. You know, somebody who's looking to the future, but is confident that they've accomplished something. So this is one of my favorite portraits of him, because it gives a sense of somebody who has accomplished something, that is looking forward to um, perhaps enjoying the fruits of his work. So, you know, you would think this is somewhere in the very end of 1864, or early 1865, before he's assassinated. And again, it's interesting. We have a conversation going on in the chat box about his how he's parting his hair, and here's one where it's parted on completely the different side of his head. So obviously there was a little lack of consistency on that. Now we have the Gettysburg Centennial Medal from 1963, and this is an interesting medal because it's one of the few that shows a facing portrait as opposed to a three-quarter portrait, and it's you can see an element here of what I mentioned earlier, where Lincoln was often portrayed in cartoons as looking like an ape because of his prominent ears and his sunken cheeks. This is one that seems to have drawn its inspiration from one of the cartoons, because his face is extremely angular. You have uh, the almost a rhomboid look to him, where you have his forehead line going down to his cheek at an angle outwards, and then a very steep angle towards his chin, to the point where without the beard, his chin would pretty much disappear. The lips look a bit too big. So it's not one of my favorite images. This is what I would call a very poor, quickly done facing portrait of him, even though it's for an important purpose for the centennial of his Gettysburg Address. The one on the right, however, on the Lincoln presidential dollar, is a much better version. Um, Still shows the same features, but in a more human, more realistic way, uh, appearing more like the actual Lincoln than the one on the left. The It's still not the greatest portrait, but at least it does express an element of Lincoln himself. In this case, as the benevolent, approachable Lincoln, uh, looking with interest out towards the audience. And here we have the iconic Lincoln cent with Victor David Brenner's portrait of Lincoln that has been memorialized and immortalized through the penny and many other copies of it on all sorts of media. Um, Here, it's a variation on the plaque that Brenner originally produced. The body is more in proportion to the head. It shows a Lincoln who's calm, uh, a bit worn down, but at the same time with a uh, hopeful and benign look, a paternalistic look almost, um, but very powerful and quite well done, and deservedly uh, a huge element of our money supply. Now we move forward to the more recent images, and part of that is shown with these images, which we've seen already, but we will move on to the latest images that have been used with the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth. So these are the cents that were produced in 2009. And the purpose here was to capture the iconic periods of Lincoln's life. So you've got the cabin. So he was born in a log cabin. He's a man of the people, and part of the Western expansion and growth of the country. Then you have Lincoln shown as the log splitter, the rail splitter, who's sitting on one of the logs that he's in the process of splitting, but he's reading a book, emphasizing that he was a self-taught man. He learned to read and educated himself. He spent very little time at school, and he eventually taught himself how to be a lawyer, and that's where the subject of the next image of the coin series appears. Here you have Lincoln standing in front of the State House and in Illinois, and his arm is raised as if he's speaking to an audience. And then you have the last one of the series, where you have the Capitol building under construction. It doesn't actually show Lincoln there, but it shows the Capitol building as it appeared when he came to Washington as president. And that's the culmination of the series. So, in conclusion, if you want to learn more about Lincoln's imagery, it has developed over the last 200 years. As it has developed over the last 200 years, one of the greatest resources is to check out Fred Reed's Abraham Lincoln, Beyond the American Icon, and his earlier and related work, Abraham Lincoln, The Image of His Greatness. Fred Reed does a wonderful job of using Lincoln's imagery in all media to discuss how he has been viewed as an American historical icon, and how that image has changed in public perception over the years as the American public has changed, and what is important in our society has changed, and Lincoln's image has changed along with it. So with that, I've completed the talk, and if there's any questions, we'd love to have you share them through the chat feature. I'm going to stop sharing the screen right now so that you can actually see a full screen of me, and I will have an easier time of reading the chat.
I can read them for you if you'd like.
Okay, thanks, Logan.
So I think the first one, what does SC and WH key SC stand for?
Actually, I don't know. I'm not sure which slide that was in. Let me see if I can find that. I mean, normally you'd think South Carolina, but it doesn't seem appropriate for this. So I don't have an answer for that right now.
I can go on to the next one. Did you say there are 130 known photos of Lincoln?
Yes, there are approximately 130 known images. Uh, in his lifetime and for the first 20 or so years after his death, it was thought that there were no more than about 20 or 25 images of Lincoln. But over the years, it turns out that Lincoln had a number of private photographs made, and they've turned up here and there in the last 150 years or so.
Neat. Okay, last one. What about gold tokens like the 1927 dated Thomas Elder issue, Delory 48 Lincoln token?
What about it?
Not sure. That's all it says.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you have to understand, this is a very short presentation to cover a huge subject matter. I mean, there are books that have been written on this. Fred Reed's books are several hundred pages with thousands of images in them. So there's a lot of material, and necessarily this is basically an overview of the subject because there's too much to show in an hour. I mean, this could be done easily as an 8-hour course. And then we'd go into much more detail and talk about the artists themselves and perhaps the reasons for images being used on any particular token, metal, coin.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Doug, for your presentation. Be sure to look at our website and see if the future webinars and join us for those. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Logan.